Hello there. Welcome back to the continuing series on faction versus. In this particular episode, we're going to be exploring two very aggressive, quite militaristic factions from two different universes. One from Star Trek, one from Andromeda. Out of universe, quite related series, with of course Star Trek being originally created by Gene Roddenberry and Andromeda being continued in his legacy, shall we say, of notes that he created for Star Trek, with many of the races and storylines and general beats of Andromeda being drawn directly from Star Trek, with some very tenuous connections between one of these factions and one of the factions from Star Trek, which I'll explain as the Neitzcheans, which are one of the combatants here, and the human augments from Star Trek, obviously having some parallels, but those aren't who they're going to be fighting. No, they are going to be, in case you didn't check from the title of this episode, the Klingons. The race that need absolutely no introduction from the greater Star Trek universe are about to get an introduction right here in a few seconds. Right then, so the Klingons, as I said, they're one of the most powerful and warlike races in the entire Alpha and Beta quadrants. Their homeworld Kronos is located at fair distance from Earth, but not so far away that they're not constantly nudging shoulders, shall we say, all the time. The Klingons have been antagonists and allies at different times throughout their history, but what do we know about the Klingons? Who are they, and how are they going to measure up here? Before we get started on that, just to lay out the ground rules, in case you've not watched one of these before in this series, because these are from two different universes where the combat rules are a little different, we have to make some assertions that they're capable of actually engaging one another. That means weapon parity, defense system parity, more or less. So at least their capabilities on a tactical level will be similar, but all other aspects, including fleet disposition, numbers, and other such things, will be taken into consideration, as this is a full-on versus, not just a few hundred ships versus a few hundred ships, set numbers, see who wins. With that out of the way, the Klingons. Let's start with their biology. In terms of physical strength, although a Klingon does seem to be on average a little bit stronger than a human, they're actually not considered in a significant increase in strength on average. What Klingons are, in opposed to necessarily stronger, is bulkier, weightier, more dense, and a lot more resilient than a human. A Klingon's body has, it is said, redundancy for every organ. It has redundancy upon redundancy. Their bones are difficult to break. If you damage one organ or muscle, it has a backup to replace it, meaning the Klingons can survive very serious and what would be to a human fatal injuries and come back swinging. Not to mention, culturally, the Klingons are generally a people who are encouraged to be strong, shall we say, with a strong martial culture where they're constantly at each other's throats as much as they are at the throats of their enemies. The Klingons as a culture are divided into various, sometimes warring houses. The greater houses make up the Klingon High Council, which are the ultimate rulers of the Klingon people underneath the Klingon Chancellor, in the past their Emperor. The modern Klingon Empire, the 24th century, shall we say, which is when we may set this, before it maybe became part of the Federation around the Dunyan War era, when I think the Klingon Empire was pretty much at its height as an independent entity. The Klingons were still ruled in this fashion, but we do know in the past they've occasionally devolved into civil war. Very recently, around that time period, with the Duras sisters and the Duras family in general leading insurgencies against the leadership, and before that, in the 23rd century, the houses were very broken and fragmented, and had been for many years, to the point where they almost couldn't get along, and it was like several miniature empires, with the Klingons having a somewhat, from an Earth standpoint, a feudalistic system. Although the houses have lesser houses that ally to them and work with them, with everyone sort of having this tiered system, with the greater houses at the top and everybody else sort of below them wanting to be them, with the Chancellor ultimately in a position where his or her job seems to be more peacekeeping amongst the houses than anything. One of the reasons the Klingons, in my personal theory, are so outwardly aggressive is to give them an enemy to fight, because otherwise the Klingons will spend their time fighting one another, which ultimately becomes counterproductive to their society. In terms of technological capabilities, they are a warp-capable spacefaring race. One of the defining qualities of their technology is their ability to cloak, which will be very important in the verses. This renders a Klingon ship near invisible to advanced sensor technology. It does, however, despite on rare occasions where there have been exceptions to this, incapable of firing its weapons or raising its shields, and there is also some vague evidence that although the Klingons can utilize their transporter technology when cloaked, their sensors are limited themselves when they are cloaked, and perhaps there is some limitations on their maximum warp capability, with some of their vessels having this limitation. However, that's a little inconclusive, so we're not too sure. The vessels themselves generally are built purely for war, with a big focus on forward-firing weapons, taking the bird of prey as an example. Although it has pretty even shielding and its armor is okay, it generally is a heavy hitter vessel with disproportionately large weapons, all of which face forwards, with absolutely no aft firing capability, meaning the Klingons always have to be facing their enemy. Always. It has one forward-firing torpedo launcher and a port and starboard super-firing cannons. These have some traverse capabilities, but generally these, although are disproportionately large guns, they pretty much fire forwards. Older version birds of prey did have some auxiliary weapons that were capable of firing aft, but the more modern ones don't seem to have this ability. Larger vessels, it's the same thing, although they do retain an aft firing capability. Something like 80% of their firepower is forward-facing. The typical armaments of a Klingon vessel include disruptors and photon torpedoes, although they have been seen to utilize other tactical systems, but there is a strong preference for disruptors. They have shields, but there's nothing inherently special in universe about Klingon shielding. They do seem to have replicator technology, but only use it for an industrial purpose, Klingons preferring to eat live food, such as a targ, or gach. Blech. Can't be a coincidence that blech and gach sound so similar, by the way. So, that's the Klingons in basic structure. There are people who, in terms of physical fighting, they like to get in close. This includes with their ships and in their physical fighting. Although they do have portable disruptors, they typically prefer to use weapons such as knives and other stabbing weapons such as the bat'leth, which, although has some range to it, is ultimately a sword, and it's not got that much range. However, with the tendency to fight in boarding actions aboard ships with tight corners, actually utilizing short-range bladed weapons does give them an advantage in some situations. So, that's the Klingons out of the way. Hi there, just interrupting whatever it is that you were just watching to shamelessly self-promote my own business. Now, for those of you who don't know, me and my partner recently started a small company which is currently online, but we're hoping will lead to our own brand and have its own physical location sometime in the future. At the moment, there are t-shirts, hoodies and other items on there that are both branded from different suppliers, as well as people I've been working with to design our own bespoke design t-shirts and hoodies, some of which were designed by my wife and others again by a third-party artist. And it's all on the website currently now. It is still growing, but any help that you could give, if there's anything on there you like, just going to the website, looking at it, is helping the website get engagement. If there's anything you do happen to like on there, then that will also be fantastic and a great way to support this channel. At the moment, there's nothing particularly on there that is directly linked to this channel, other than the fact that I'm a little different as a person, generally speaking, and I've made a website that reflects something like that of my personality. I don't want to create a brand that's entirely normal, quote unquote, and wanted to go a little different. At the moment, again, it is still in the early stages of its growth, but any help that can be provided by you would be greatly appreciated. And with that said, back to whatever it is you were just watching. Next, we have the Neitzcheans. To give them a little bit more context to their backstory, the Neitzcheans are a genetically engineered race of humans. They were originally created by human scientists that left Earth and went out into deep space to form a new civilization, a perfect civilization, if you will. These genetically augmented humans were descendants of a single individual, actually, whose genetic profile imprinted on all of them, called Drago Musavini, he being the first true Neitzchean. In terms of physical appearance, Neitzcheans look like a human, but they have 3 protruding bone blades which are regenerative on their forelimbs. These are retractable as well and have some minor serration. They start to grow somewhere around puberty and give the Neitzcheans a natural weapon. Although I doubt it could really take a hit from a bat'leth, there is one difference I will point out, that in a hand-to-hand combat situation, a Neitzchean has their weapons built in, whereas a Klingon's got to reach for it. Physicality-wise, the average Neitzchean is at least 5 times stronger than a proportionally sized human. They have increased hand-eye coordination, stamina, strength, intellect, as well as sensor acuity. Their hearing and their eyesight are exceptionally accurate. Neitzcheans are also fairly durable, but I doubt they're as durable as a Klingon, but they are very likely physically much stronger and more agile than your average Klingon. And in a hand-to-hand fight, that will count at least for something. In terms of their technological capabilities, the Neitzcheans are one of the more advanced spacefaring races in the galaxy. Their ships, although utilize FTL capabilities, they utilize something called slipstream, which, similar to hyperspace in Star Wars, has some limitations on where it can and can't go. However, it is still FTL capable and notably much faster than conventional warp used by the Klingons. Their vessels are armed typically with missile systems, but they also have point defense lasers, which are designed to shoot down incoming energy weapons as well as other hard, solid weapons and projectiles, such as other missiles or potentially a photon torpedo. They do have some energy projector weapons on their ships, but their main offensive batteries are typically missiles. They lack shields, but their vessels are quite well armoured, probably more so than a Klingon ship, as they're designed to directly take the beating whenever something gets past their interceptors. They also carry large waves of fighters on board and have quite large crew complements. They lack anything like a transporter or a replicator technology and have no known form of stealth technology equivalent to that of a Klingon cloaking device. In terms of their culture, actually here is where I think the two races have the most in common. Klingons and Neitzcheans are very similar in a lot of ways. Neitzcheans are more of a male-dominated patriarchal society than the Klingons are, but other than that minor detail, you could equate the Neitzchean prides, which are basically small nation states of Neitzcheans that have shifting loyalties and spin off from one another and are generally ruled by the strongest, most intelligent, most ruthless, and most cruel and most cunning amongst their numbers. They're very similar to the Klingon great houses. The prides will work together when they have a common enemy. But like Klingons, when they don't have a common enemy, they revert to fighting each other. But this is actually considered a cultural strength amongst the Neitzcheans. If you are able to survive in competition with members of your own kind like this, you will rise to the top and succeed in whatever endeavours you are. You become more respected if you become a greater survivor. And Neitzcheans consider cunning, ruthlessness, treachery to be positive traits. So for you to be a trusting and good person amongst the Neitzcheans is probably going to mean you're weak, and you might get killed by members of your own family, or you'll become exiled. Any pride that is not self-aware enough, sensitive enough, secure enough, and vigilant enough to prevent its own destruction at the hands of other Neitzcheans is actually considered good for the gene pool to get rid of them. So the Neitzcheans are all about selective breeding, constantly breeding so that every generation is stronger and more intelligent and more cunning than the last one. In their heyday, the Neitzcheans were considered some of the greatest architects, scholars, and writers of the system's commonwealth, which they were formerly part of before becoming the Neitzchean Empire. The Neitzcheans, though, this division also sometimes comes as a weakness. It can be exploited when someone forges an alliance with one group who have a particular dislike of another, that they've been around long enough that, similar to old nations of Earth, there are certain rivalries that kind of are subtle and don't really make sense to an outsider, but to these Neitzcheans, it's like if you are Drago Katsov and you are Sober Jaguar, you don't really like each other. If you're Kodiak and, again, Drago Katsov, you don't like each other, to the point where one will try and destroy the other, and one even nearly successfully did wipe out the other one. So in some ways, it's a weakness, but in others, it does mean that they are constantly making themselves stronger, and the weaker amongst their own kind are eliminated. And when they do have a real enemy to fight, something to come together to do, they will do it, such as fighting the Commonwealth, fighting the Magog, or whoever. The Neitzcheans will come together, if necessary, to fight that enemy, but their internal divisions often creep back and prevent them accomplishing the goal that the Klingons have sort of achieved of becoming a true empire in the United States. However, the internal fighting amongst the Neitzcheans is considered to be a temporary thing until the return of their progenitor, the genetic reincarnation of Drago Museveni, who will unite the prides under him and make them forge themselves into a true united people and singular empire. This was done by a false prophet called Tir Anasazi, who pretended to be the genetic reincarnation And he managed to unite the Neitzcheans, even the prides that didn't like each other, quite happily. Of course, there were still individual outliers, but generally speaking, as a people, they came together. Now, we can only imagine what the true Drago would do, so let's assume that he is actually now an adult and has united the prides, because we need the Neitzcheans to kind of be working together for this, I think. And ultimately, I think they would, against an enemy they would perceive that could destroy them all, which the Klingons could very well do. I think they would. So how do they actually match up? In a single engagement, the Klingons are going to first contact with the Neitzcheans. Neitzcheans are going to superficially seem, they're going to kind of violent, but from a Klingon point of view, just like they did when they encountered human augments, they're going to instantly underestimate them. They'll scan them and detect Patak life signs and think to themselves, stupid Umis, we'll just kill them. And they'll try and suddenly realize that they're up against something a little different than your average Homo sapien. You're up against Homo sapien invictus, and it's a much more cunning enemy. Like the augments of their own universe, the Neitzcheans will have great advantages in the early stages of any engagement, most because the Klingons have underestimated them. They're faster, more agile, more aggressive in some ways than the Klingons in these early engagements. But Klingons rally quickly. One advantage that the Klingons have is their stealth capability. The Neitzcheans, I highly doubt, will have the technological capability to penetrate Klingon cloak. They might try and steal it, they might try and find routes around it, but I highly doubt they're going to get their hands on one, and they will not be able to penetrate it. The Klingons are going to be able, as a result, to run sneak attacks around the Neitzcheans. The Neitzcheans, however, have ships that are substantially faster than the average Klingon vessel, but I would say, on average, weaker. Especially when you're talking about the Vorchak class and the Nekvar class cruisers of the Klingon Empire. I don't think anything the Neitzcheans have comes close to comparing to the tactical capabilities of these ships, and with their cloaking devices they will be able to infiltrate and attack Neitzchean bases behind their lines, forcing the Neitzcheans to retain a large fleet back. But with their ability to move forces so quickly, the Neitzcheans will be able to strike fast and hard at the Klingons. Also, disposition of forces, the Neitzchean fleet is one of the largest fleets in their home universe. One Neitzchean pride alone has the third largest fleet across 3 galaxies. That's one pride. Putting them all together, we're probably talking at least the second largest fleet, only because I believe the actual largest race that have a fleet in the Andromeda universe have such a big fleet. It's so overwhelmingly massive, I highly doubt that the Neitzchean combined force comes anywhere near to it. So it's probably the second largest. We are probably definitely talking actually about tens of thousands of Neitzchean warships, which is going to be at least twice the size of the Klingon fleet. However, the average Klingon vessel I'm going to put as an easy twice as strong as your average Neitzchean vessel. So the Neitzcheans are going to want to close that gap and, wherever possible, board a Klingon ship and fight them directly. This will actually play to the Klingons' ego. Klingons also like to fight directly, so when it comes to planets, they'll fight. Both powers don't like to simply obliterate a habitable world. The Klingons are more likely to do it than the Neitzcheans, but both races will want to take a planet directly and in ground engagement, and that both races excel. Neitzcheans wear heavy armor, they wear heavy caliber weapons, and again come with their nice little bone blades and are physically very strong. They prefer to fight at a distance more so than the Klingons, but the Klingons are readily adapt to that strategy. They'll bombard them from orbit, they'll send in attack craft, they'll shoot them as well with disruptors at range, just like the Neitzcheans will. When it comes down to this kind of attrition, I think it's going to come down to numbers, who gets the first hit, who gets the biggest surprise. So there's a good 50-50 split very easily between all these engagements. So then it's coming up to who's getting naval superiority. The Neitzcheans have the advantage of being able to run rings around the Klingons, and although their weapons seem more crude, again, they can strip away Klingon shielding, because Klingon shields are not that special, and the Klingons do have to decloak to fire. And even using fighting or cloak tactics, in a direct engagement, the Neitzcheans are going to have numbers, so the Klingons have to whittle them down. But I think that's where the Klingons' better strategies of fighting more cloaked, hitting them behind their lines, and stealthier raids using squadrons of birds of prey is going to start to tip the scales. Yeah, in a ground engagement, it's 50-50, but in space, even though the Klingon fleet is smaller and slower, and their ships less heavily armed, the caliber of their weapons is superior. The range of the weapons is likely similar. Now, although they do have point defense systems, the Neitzcheans are going to be struggling without shields to engage antimatter style weapons being fired at them. Now, the Neitzcheans do have some higher yield weapons, but nothing compared to what, say, the Klingons have at their disposal in some ways. So I think the war is going to be a war of attrition, but ultimately the Klingons are going to start to win out. Yeah, the Neitzcheans are going to take territory, they're going to crack worlds, they're going to burn planets, they're going to wipe out colonies, destroy shipyards, but so are the Klingons. The Neitzcheans' internal divisions, they'll be being led by the bigger prides, i.e. the Drago-Katsov and the Sobra Jaguar, most likely as the two largest of the Neitzchean prides. Two prides that already don't like each other. They'll both be trying to subtly get one over on each other. Like, in a particularly difficult engagement, the Drago-Katsov will try and make it so it's mostly the Sobra Jaguar wasting their resources doing it. This is going to create an internal struggle where they might start getting at each other as they get annoyed, and the smaller prides will pick sides. And although they'll remain focused on the fight with the Klingons will see this. And the Klingons are not stupid. They're going to do exactly what the enemy wants them to do. If they see that the Drago-Katsov are trying to force the Sobra Jaguar fleet to waste its resources fighting them, they will focus on that and even potentially leave Drago-Katsov ships alone. This means that with their internal treacherous nature, some of the Neitzcheans in the Sobra Jaguar might think that the Drago-Katsov, because they have a pretty treacherous reputation, may have actually switched sides and made a deal with the Klingons. That internal division, although I do not think it will be enough to actually cause the Neitzchean alliance to break down, that suspicion and intrigue will start to make a less efficient military, as the Sobra Jaguar forces will start refusing to engage in certain engagements. They'll pull back to a more defensive line, and although they will still fight, it'll start to unbalance things. And by the time the Neitzcheans figure out that it's actually Klingon subterfuge, it's probably going to be too late. And I think the Klingons are coming out as a victor here. Not without a hell of a bloody nose, but they're going to engage them, and they're going to break them, and they're going to force the Neitzcheans back into purely defensive roles. And they'll either force a surrender, or continue on to completely annihilate, as the Neitzcheans are not big on surrendering to an enemy. But eventually, the Klingons will whittle down their defenses. Once they've got them on the run, they've got them on the ropes, the Klingons will start targeting their resource colonies, their slave worlds. They'll start targeting their shipyards. They'll break the Neitzcheans' ability to deploy forces. The Neitzcheans' only hope at this point would either be some kind of negotiated truce, which with Klingons, they would see that as a weakness and attack more, and also with the Neitzcheans' untrustworthy nature, and by this point in the war quite well established untrustworthiness and tendency to break their deals, the Klingons aren't going to believe anything the Neitzcheans say. So they're just going to disregard this. The Neitzcheans will either have to capitulate and surrender, or try to effectively retreat, which would require them to abandon their colonies and outposts and bases, but they probably would be able to do that because the Klingons don't have the capacity to move across the entire galaxy, whereas the Neitzcheans do. So Neitzcheans are also exceptionally good defensive planners. They have very good orbital defenses and good planetary defenses, far better than those of the Klingons, which would give the Klingons at least some pause in this war of attrition as to whether or not it would truly be worth trying to fully conquer a Neitzchean world. Look at the plasma cannon used by the Orca Pride. A small pride of Neitzcheans, numbering only a few thousand strong, a handful of ships, but they had a singular gun built into an asteroid capable of taking on a capital ship on its own. Now, extrapolate that to the bigger prides and just imagine what they can do. So, it would be a choice for the Klingons as to whether or not they'd want to break what was left of their forces that are already haggard from this war, really take in these worlds, or maybe perhaps allow the Neitzcheans to retreat. But that's where I get to with this. I don't think the Klingons would be able to fully subjugate the Neitzcheans. I think it'd be a Pyrrhic victory if they actually tried. They might be successful, but they would be so broken, so injured from it, it wouldn't be worth it for them. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below, because I really want to hear your thoughts, because when I was thinking of this particular matchup, I couldn't think of two more similar races from two different universes than the Klingons and the Neitzcheans. They're so similar in so many ways. I think the Neitzcheans are a little bit more divided than the Klingons, and they haven't yet come together like the Klingons have, but they've definitely got the potential to do it, especially under Drago Museveni, who would of course be leading them, but Neitzcheans being Neitzcheans, they're basically Neitzchean gonna Neitzchean. And I just don't think they've culturally matured to the level that the Klingons have, where they're not divided. There is, of course, the wildcard possibility that, again, the Duras family would attempt to make some kind of backdoor deal with the Neitzcheans, just like they did with the Romulans. to try to gain power themselves, maybe undermine Chancellor, whatever, Gowron, say, and usurp power for themselves, becoming even a vassal state, pretending to be for the Neitzcheans in order to end the war. That is a possibility, but my guess would be their forces were never really strong enough to directly challenge the greater Klingon Empire, so I don't think the Neitzcheans would have gone for it, other than maybe just causing a little bit of disruption, which I think is all that would have accomplished. But again, what do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section below, and again, like, share and subscribe, and check out more videos in this playlist and others. I have both an extensive Andromeda playlist as well as an extremely extensive Star Trek one. Thank you for watching. If you made it all to the video. Bye bye.